Focus on Headline. What made the headlines today? Let's delve into some of the major issues this Wednesday. And for that, I'm joined by Han Da-eun and Lee Ji-young in the studio. Good evening, guys.
Good evening. Soa.
All right, so let's start off with the World Bank, which cut this year's global growth forecast to 1.7%, which is the bank's third lowest global outlook in 3 decades. So Da-eun, what is behind this gloomy picture?
Right, so the growth cut is down sharply from its previous estimate of 3% made in June. The World Bank said that global growth is expected to slow perilously close to recession this year, citing high inflation, rising interest rates, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It analyzes that looking back at the past 20 years, these levels of economic slowdown led to a global economic recession. Now, the projection comes as economists have repeatedly warned of a slump in the world economy as countries battle soaring costs, with central banks simultaneously raising interest rates to cool inflation. And this, of course, as a result, is worsening global financial conditions on top of ongoing disruptions from the prolonged war in Ukraine. The World Bank's latest forecast points to a sharp, long-lasting slowdown, with growth pegged at 1.7%, which is among the weakest rates seen in nearly 3 decades, overshadowed only by the pandemic-induced recession of 2020 and the global financial crisis in 2009. The U.S.-based bank said that given fragile economic conditions, any new adverse development could push the global economy into recession. Now, possible adverse developments include higher than expected inflation, sudden spikes in interest rates to contain price hikes, or a pandemic resurgence. It projects the growth in advanced economies to slow from 2.5% last year to 0.5% this year, with the growth in the U.S. also likely to slow to 0.5%, which is 1.9 percentage point lower than earlier projection. It expects a flat line in European economies as the region battles severe energy supply disruptions and price hikes triggered by Russia's invasion. The bank predicted China's growth rate to recover to 4.3% from 2.7% last year, but still the projection is 0.9 percentage point lower than its earlier forecast. It cited lingering pandemic risks and dampened external demand as the factors that will drag down the world's second largest economy. Now, for emerging economies and developing countries, it gave a 2.7% projection, down by 1.1 percentage point from last year. World Bank President David Malpass warned that emerging and developing countries are facing a multi-year period of slow growth driven by heavy debt burdens and weak investment.
So it really looks like 2023 won't be much better than 2022. Actually, it looks even gloomier. Mm-hmm. But you mentioned that the World Bank has mentioned China's growth rate, for instance. But there was no particular mentioning of South Korea there, right?
No, you've raised a good point there. I was about to mention it, but it seems like I forgot to put it in my article. But no, there were no particular mention of South Korea.
I think that might be actually even good news that we've not been really particularly mentioned. Well, the entire global growth looks to be going downhill. So
right.
Let's hope it could be
a silver lining.
Yeah,
we'll have to see, but
yes, we'll have to see. So we've been slowly getting back to our pre-pandemic lives meanwhile, and we're seeking the job market to become more and more vibrant. That's why South Korea reported the most significant increase in jobs in 22 years in 2022. So Ji-young, can you tell us more about this issue?
Sure. Now, according to Statistic Korea on Wednesday, the number of employed people last year rose by 816,000 to a little over 28 million. However, it's likely that employment growth will slow throughout this year due to the sluggish economy, as you both mentioned. And the government projects that the number of employed people will increase by 100,000 this year, which is higher than what the Bank of Korea has forecasted, which is 90,000. And also the Korea Development Institute's 80,000. By sector, South Korea added 180,000 jobs in healthcare, 135,000 jobs in manufacturing, 71,000 in public services, and 62,000 in education. On the other hand, the jobs in retail and wholesale and financing decreased compared to a year ago. Also, the number of employed increased in all ages of groups. People aged 60 and older accounted for 50% of the growth, which the specific numbers are 452,000. Now, the employment rate for those aged 15 and older rose by 1.6 percentage points on year to reach 62.1% last year, which is the highest since South Korea started compiling data in 1963. And for the employment rate for those aged 15 to 64, reached the highest in history. Also, some good news is that the employment rate also fell as well, with 2.9%, which is down 0.8 percentage as well on year. However, as we're seeing a growth in the number of jobs, as you both mentioned, the overall economic growth has been seeing a decrease for the past 7 consecutive months. So also in 2023, it doesn't look like the economic growth will be any better than it was last year.
At least more individuals get more jobs.
That's right.
So staying with the economy now, South Korea's current account balance, the backbone of the country's economy, turned into a deficit again in November last year amid a sharp decrease in key export items like chips and chemical products. Tan, give us the numbers.
So we briefly mentioned that perhaps World Bank's not mentioning anything in particular about South Korea, maybe the silver lining, but our next story begs to differ. South Korea posted the first current account deficit in 3 months in November as exports sharply dwindled amid growing concerns over a global economic recession. The deficit came on mounting concerns over a global recession prompted by aggressive monetary tightening of major economies and draconian COVID-19 restrictions in China. According to the Bank of Korea, the current account deficit amounted to $620 million, which is a sharp drop from a surplus of $880 million posted a month earlier. The figure is also a huge decrease compared to a surplus of nearly $7 billion logged in the same month the year before. But Korea did manage to pull off a cumulative current account surplus during the January to November period, which stood at around $24 billion. The BOK predicts an annual surplus of $25 billion for 2022. Korea exported around $52 billion worth of goods and services in November, down by 12% on year on weakened global demand. Sales of semiconductors in particular dropped sharply, plugging over 28% on year in November, while that of chemical products and steel products also fell by 16% and 11% respectively. By region, exports to China dropped by a whopping 25% on year, while outbound shipments to Southeast Asia and Japan declined by 20% and 18% respectively. Imports, meanwhile, rose 0.6% to nearly $54 billion in November, which resulted in a current account deficit of nearly $2 billion. We saw a sharp rise in imports of raw materials, with gas imports in particular soaring by nearly 45%. Falling freight rates and increasing outbound travel amid eased virus curbs also led to an increase in the service account deficit in November. The service account, which includes outlays by South Koreans in overseas trips and transport earnings, posted a shortfall of $340 million. The outlook for December's current account remains uncertain amid falling exports and increasing trade deficit. The government projects Korea to post a current account surplus this year overall, but it remains murky as exports continue to fall.
It looks like we will have to find some solutions to this, diversify the countries we export to, because no longer is the U.S. and China the only places we have to target. So let's do hope that there are going to be better figures coming out in the rest of the year, although we're just at the beginning of the year. Now let's move on to diplomacy and South Korea-China ties. China has stopped issuing short-term visas to individuals from South Korea in retaliation for COVID-19 restrictions on Chinese travelers. So Ji-young, how will this affect South Korean businesses as well as Koreans that are living in China?
Yeah, this doesn't really affect regular people who have day-to-day lives in Korea, but this has definitely come to a shock for Koreans who are residing in China at the moment. Now, because many of them were hoping that the local economy and businesses would benefit from the wake of China's reopening of their borders, but China will still be issuing work visas and student visas for South Koreans, but they have halted all of the tourist visas. Now, this means that individuals who want to visit China, who want to see their relatives, will also be rejected. And if you're planning to get a work visa, before you submit an invitation letter from before you would have to submit an invitation letter from the Chinese company or the government, but now you have to submit the invitation letter only that was issued by the local government. This means that it's expected for only small number of people to get work visas. Also, today it was reported that transit visa waiver programs, people who didn't have to have a visa, who were only transiting through China, those visas were waived, but now those for South Korea and Japanese passport holders will also be suspended as well. Now, Korean companies with semiconductor factories in China, such as Samsung Electronics, SK Hynix, are closely monitoring the visa suspension. Now, this is because there are no major restrictions on the arrival and departure for the local expatriates, but it has become impossible for employees who are based in Korea to go to the factories in China. And I'm sure this would affect other companies in China, but this would affect a lot of the semiconductor industry, because there are a lot of short and long business trips that are needed in China. So industry insiders say that this would most definitely affect production if this suspension is going on for a long term.
Right. It's a pity that we're seeing this retaliation, because it's not the first time that we're seeing retaliations from China when it comes to traveling, because
That's right.
years ago we had the THAAD issue, which is why China unofficially banned tourism groups to come to South Korea. And then this year we were expecting more tourism to boost between China and South Korea, but then we have a surge in COVID-19 infections, and then this. Now, South Korea and Japan are not the only countries imposing entry requirements on travelers from China, though. More than a dozen countries have announced new rules for travelers departing from China, but Seoul and Tokyo's measures are among the most stringent, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. Like the United States, Australia, and others like France announced that travelers from China must test negative for COVID before entering. So that's pretty much what we're asking for as well. Also, Morocco has even banned all Chinese nationals from entering the country, even if they've been confirmed negative. Even though Morocco has imposed such a strong ban on the entry of Chinese nationals, China appears to have calculated that the level of ties and exchange it shares with Maghreb were not an adequate level for sending a message. On the other hand, with millions of Korean and Japanese people coming to and from China, there would be a lot more on the line. So China has insisted that its actions are not retaliatory but based on reciprocity. But experts say that Beijing seems to have judged that restricting visa issuance would be a way to set an example. The United Nations also stepped in and has voiced concerns about China's suspension of short-term visas from South Korea as well as the neighboring Japan. In a briefing on Tuesday, the UN called on its members to abide by World Health Organization guidelines with regard to COVID-19 prevention. Also, that they stress the importance of a border screening being based on scientific grounds. So this is kind of giving a hint to China, but they didn't really actually mention China. It was just like a hint.
A hint.
Right.
All right. And following China's retaliatory move against Korea's boosted border restrictions for people arriving from China, Korean health authorities stressed that the toughened quarantine measures were implemented for public health and safety, which is, of course, the government's top priority. Tan, tell us more.
Sure. At a press briefing held today, a senior official at the Central Disease Control Headquarters, Im Soo-kyung, emphasized that the government decided to strengthen measures at border checkpoints for inbound travelers from China for the health and safety of the people in Korea, and that the reinforced measures are objective, based on scientific grounds. She mentioned that, in fact, COVID positivity rate among inbound travelers from China soared to 30% at one point after China's reopening. Now, soon after China retreated its zero COVID policy, the South Korean government mandated PCR testing upon arrival and added an additional layer of quarantine afterwards, requiring a negative test result for passengers flying into Korea when boarding planes. Short-term visa issuance has also been suspended for the majority of individuals from China. So we can see that China did, it's a kind of tit-for-tat move because this actually, in fact, to be honest, came first from South Korea. Im added that the boosted measures were inevitable due in part to concerns over possible influx of new variants from China, Korea's closest neighbor geographically, on top of rising uncertainties after China halted releasing official COVID tallies. Now, while projections vary among experts on when the wave of new infections will peak in China, some experts say, advisor to government Chung Ki-seok says it'll peak sometime within this month, while some other experts say it may peak in late March. So opinions, they vary, but the Disease Control Agency says it will continue to keep close tabs amid lingering risks of new variants and their impact. The government maintains that the boosted border restrictions will stay unless we see a substantial downswing in COVID tallies in the neighboring country. Meanwhile, President Yoon ordered the foreign ministry today to give a thorough explanation to China on our government's stance that the measures were needed for people's safety and that the decision was based on science. So obviously, President Yoon, having in mind the very close economic ties with China here.
Right. And that is why there is actually no need for Korea to, implement these restrictions with having China in mind. It's just having COVID in mind. So it's kind of difficult to say it's retaliatory measures from South Korea's side, of course, even not. But also, it's also difficult to blame China for issuing its measures. Should we just blame COVID-19 for, again, surging in China? It's a really difficult issue, and especially because we have Lunar New Year holidays ahead of us, which is also a huge festivity in China, and we would have loved to see an influx of visitors coming to China if we hadn't had this sudden increase in cases. So it's really a difficult situation. We all wish it would improve. But let's also get a quick check on the latest COVID tallies actually here in Korea, because new infections are actually on a clear downward trend despite China risks, with the reproduction rate, which is a key indicator of the COVID spread, falling below 1 for the first time in 12 weeks. So Tan, give us the latest figures, please.
Right. Korea added roughly 54,300 new cases today, down by 5,000 from the previous record. The figure is lower by 24,000 from a week ago and by 33 thousand from 2 weeks ago. So we're seeing a clear downward trend despite concerns over the possible influx of cases from China. And amid the decline, the reproductive rate also fell below 1 for the first time in 12 weeks, rather. The reproduction rate is, as you know, I'm sure most of us already know this by now. Yeah. It's a measure of its transmission or the number of new infections generated by each case. If the rate is less than 1, it means an outbreak is subsiding. But the number of critically ill patients and COVID deaths are yet to fall. Severe cases remained in the 500 range for over a week, while 76 people died of COVID overnight, which is up by 32 from the previous record. Rising number of imported cases is another huge concern. And among the 120 new overseas transmissions posted today, over 60% were from China. Nearly 50 of 320 short-term visitors from China tested positive upon arrival yesterday alone, despite pre-flight negative test result requirements imposed earlier this month. According to the Korea Disease Control and Prevention Agency today, over 1,100 out of around 6,400 people who entered from China during the first week of January tested positive upon arrival. This means 1 in 5 travelers from China were infected with COVID during that period. Most of the cases were Omicron subvariant BA.5, which is the dominant strain here in Korea as well.
All right. And also, nearly 90% of people in Henan, which is China's third most populous province, have now been infected with COVID. That is an extremely high percentage. Tsiyoung, can you give us the details?
Sure. Now, China is battling an unprecedented surge in cases after abandoning their zero COVID policies in December. And provincial official Kan Quin-cheng revealed that the figure of about 88.5 million people have been infected with COVID-19. Now, the Hainan official did not specify a timeline for when all the infections happened, but it's likely that the vast majority of Hainan's infections occurred in the past few weeks. Now, he said visits to fewer clinics in Hainan province peaked on December 19th, after which it showed a continuous downward trend. Now, what's noteworthy is that the Hainan provincial figures are in stark contrast to COVID figures from the central government. Now, according to official data, just 120,000 people in the country of the 1.4 billion population have been infected, and 30 died since the shift in COVID policy. Other local and provincial officials have also been providing very different data to that from the central government. Last year on Christmas Eve, a senior health official in the port city of Qingdao reported that 500,000 people were infected each day. But those case figures were swiftly removed from news reports in China. Now, as you mentioned, Soa, with the new Lunar New Year just around the corner, infections are expected to spike, and Chinese officials say that more than 2 billion individual travelers will be expecting to travel around the country.
So while they're not while they're not allowed to get into other countries before getting tests for PCR tests, or in some countries they're not even allowed to enter.
That's right.
Within China, if they have all this traveling happening, there are concerns that there's going to be a bigger spread. But as Tan earlier mentioned, maybe the peak will actually come earlier than expected. But South Korea has also boosted quarantine measures for people entering from Hong Kong. While earlier Hong Kong was actually exempt from these measures. And although the country did not make retaliatory moves, it did ask Korea to lift certain measures. So Tan, what was their request?
Well, South Korea announced earlier that flights from Hong Kong and Macau can only land at the Incheon International Airport, affecting local flight operations bound for airports in Busan and Jeju Island. And Hong Kong has asked Korea to withdraw what it claimed are unreasonable restrictions. A local government official said that the Hong Kong government has written to the Korean authority and liaised with the Consulate General of Korea and Hong Kong to express grave concern and strongly request the authority to withdraw the restriction. According to local news outlets, some 40 flights of Hong Kong Express were affected, while the restriction derailed planned trips of Cantonese people to popular travel destinations outside of Seoul during the upcoming Lunar New Year holiday. Now this, while one-way flights to Seoul around the holiday from Hong Kong shot up to 4,000 Hong Kong dollars, which is around $500, which is roughly double the non-peak prices. The measure also affects transit passengers who plan to take a domestic flight to Busan or Jeju or elsewhere after landing at Incheon Airport. Some local tour companies complain that the abrupt ban is not only a buzzkill for tourists in Hong Kong after 3 years under strict travel restrictions, but it also affects hospitality businesses in South Korea, it points out. So it's saying that it's a lose-lose situation. The airport restriction, which will remain in place until February 28th, came on top of a pre-flight negative test result requirement for passengers entering via air from Hong Kong and Macau.
So before we move on, just very quickly, what do you think of these measures? Now, we thought that we would be now in a kind of endemic period now, but endemic era. But do you think this is all necessary, these new restrictions targeted at specific countries like China?
You know, so I may be getting old, but I think it's always better to be on the safer side.
Oh, I agree, actually. So am I getting old too?
So I think it is. I think these measures are actually necessary, especially given the closeness, the geographic closeness of South Korea and China,
right,
and the huge population, the huge influx of people from China. Before these pre-flight requirements and PCR testing upon arrival were required, we saw like over 1,000 tourists streaming in from China per day. Now we're seeing less number of people thanks to these measures. And we're not going to have these measures forever. The government has made clear that this airport limiting flights from Hong Kong and Macau, limiting only to Incheon International Airport, this will only stay until February 28th. So we're not saying it's here to stay forever. We'll just be very cautious and be on the safe side for as long as we can to closely monitor how things unfold from this point.
Right. And Ji-young, what do you think?
Yeah, and it's always, I agree, it's better to be safe than sorry. And also, and going back to China, I think I have to say the proof is in the pudding. The number of people, the statistics that were shown from the South Korean government of the people who had been with COVID and coming to Korea, and that's not the numbers that add up in China mainland if they have been given the proper numbers. And as I reported before, there's the central government and also different provinces are giving out different numbers. So there's different numbers and different statistics. So we can't really rely on those numbers. So I'm really happy to see that South Korea is going on the more scientific and more transparent side and put their policies in place so that our citizens can be, and also people here, the residents in Korea can also be protected.
Right. You made a good point. We can't rely on the numbers, and that is why if we were not sure, then it's better to be safe than sorry.
Absolutely.
And I also realized that how Tan mentioned that there's been like 1,000 people from China coming in every day on a daily basis to Korea. And you can really feel that when you're walking around in Myeongdong in downtown Seoul, because we have seen recently more foreigners back in the streets, but really fewer Chinese people. So we do really hope that this will not continue into a diplomatic issue. And as the Korean government said, that it will just make these restrictions until February for now. And then if the figures go down, let's hope that China will also lift its measures that it has just implemented on Korea, including regarding the visas. So let's move on to other issues now. Director Park Chan-wook's romantic thriller film Decision to Leave. Have you guys watched this actually?
No,
Not yet.
Yeah.
Me neither. But unfortunately, it came short of winning the Best Non-English Language Film at the 80th Golden Globe Awards on Tuesday. So, Jiyoung, first off, who was the winner? And also, can you tell us what other movies were nominated?
Sure. Now, during the awards ceremony held at the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Los Angeles on Tuesday, local time, that prize went to, as you mentioned in the opening, the Argentinian director Santiago Mitre's historical drama film Argentina 1985. Now, other nominees were the German anti-war epic All Quiet on the Western Front, Close, a coming-of-age drama film produced by Belgium, France, and the Netherlands, and also the Indian action drama RRR. Park won Best Director at last year's Cannes Film Festival, and the film has been chosen as South Korea's entry for the Best International Film category at the 95th Academy Awards, which is coming up in March. And also, this movie has been nominated for a Critics' Choice Award as well, competing in the Best Foreign Film category, which will be held on January 15th. Now, even though Park didn't win, the nomination itself is quite an accomplishment because this is the first year that a Korean actor or a production has been nominated at the event, which shows that Korean content is just not a one-hit wonder.
It sure isn't. So let's cross our fingers for other good results coming out in the Korean movie industry in the rest of the year. And now let's move over to our last item of the day, I believe, to the latest on the new U.S. Congress. After a post-Civil War record of 15 rounds of votes, the House of Representatives finally selected Kevin McCarthy as the new speaker. And the Republicans were quick to make new changes to standing committees. So, Tan, what do we need to know on this?
Well, unlike Korean parliament, the party that holds the seat majority gets to chair all standing committees in the U.S. And what's interesting to note from Korea's standpoint is that chairmen of the House committees related to North Korea were mostly replaced with hardliners. For starters, Mike Rogers, known for his hawkish stance, was officially selected to serve as chairman of the House Armed Services Committee in the 118th Congress. After clinching the post, he said that the U.S. faces unprecedented threats from China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, and that the U.S. military should focus on lethality and capability in order to deter these threats and remain the most feared force in the world. Michael McCall of Texas, also known for his hawkish stance against China, will lead the Committee on Foreign Affairs. He has long been critical of the Biden administration, saying that the unprecedented levels of North Korea threats are a result of the administration's weak policies. He called for a new hardline North Korea policy that controls North Korean leader Kim Jong-un through overwhelming military capability based on strong alliance with South Korea and Japan. Jason Smith of Missouri was selected to lead the powerful Ways and Means Committee, which oversees all tax law. He has long asserted revision of the controversial IRA, or Inflation Reduction Act. And so South Korea is pinning hopes that the discriminatory elements against South Korean firms on electric vehicles may also be brought to the table for negotiations. But we are pinning hopes for the rediscussion of the IRA, but it's highly unlikely that the discriminatory elements against South Korean firms will take center stage when discussing the IRA revision, because the main focus of the revision or the rediscussion would probably be centered on the budgetary support for the IRS or Internal Revenue Service.
Right. Well, the U.S. has really different political systems compared to South Korea, different voting systems and everything. But in the end, the results can affect allies such as South Korea too. And that is why we are keeping a close eye to these developments in the U.S. political arena as well. And with that, that's it for Focus on Headline today. Thank you very much, Tan. Thank you very much, Jiyoung. And I hope to see you again.
Thank you.
You can listen to Korea Now with me, SJ Lee, by downloading the Arirang Radio application or tune in online by visiting www.arirangradio.com. So make sure you tune in Mondays through Fridays, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Korea time.